So what are the benefits of this friendly multicultural model, and can it be emulated? With me in the studio to tackle those questions is Douglas Murray, founder of the Centre for Social Cohesion and associate editor of The Spectator magazine. And also with me is our Americas editor, Brooke Unger, who travelled around Canada for our reporting. Douglas and Brooke will be facing off in a bit of a boxing match with me as the referee. Welcome to you both. So let's get into round one. In an interview for this paper, Justin Trudeau expounded on multiculturalism and what it means to Canadians.
We've always understood that diversity is a source of strength in our communities, not a source of weakness. And we've learnt that through difficult experiences where we didn't highlight that. So there is an understanding that openness to others has been part of the story of success of this country.
So, Brooke, let's start with you. Is Canada's multiculturalism its big asset?
Well, I think it's certainly one of its big assets. I mean, Canada has shown that it's able to welcome and incorporate people from many, many different ethnic backgrounds, national backgrounds, and to cope very happily with a very high level of immigration, which, Canadians believe very strongly is good for its economy and makes Canada stand out in a world where a lot of other countries are sort of slamming the doors on immigration. I certainly think that it ought to be heartening to other countries that do have high levels of immigration to see a country that openly celebrates that kind of multicultural diversity.
Douglas Murray sounds like a good thing.
There are all sorts of things in the Canadian model that have worked quite well. I think that, generally speaking, Canada is slightly better at integration than some Western European countries, for instance. There is a problem, I have to say, of a country self-defining itself in these terms, though. To say that you are a multicultural country, a country which can integrate the world, several problems with it. Firstly, of course, it's always a numbers game and it's always an identity game. As long as the numbers are comparatively low, as they have actually been in Canada recently compared to, say, Germany in the last 18 months, then some, cohesion of society is possible, some integration is possible. There's also the question, though, of can a society continue with relatively high levels of immigration and identify itself as effectively an international country? And what I mean by that is we're quite used now to celebrating international cities. We all say London is a wonderful international city, but international countries is something else. And that is something which I think in the long term sets up a whole set of problems which no country can evade.
Brooke?
I mean, first of all, you say that immigration into Canada is relatively low. I wouldn't agree that it's relatively low. I mean, Canada takes in about 300,000 newcomers a year, which is close to 1% of its population. Compared with Britain, it's a much higher proportion of its population than the British take in. I mean, it's true that Germany has taken in a big influx of refugees recently, but that's it has been at least an exceptional thing. I mean, Canada has been doing this for 20 or 30 years. Your remark that to become an international country is a problem, I think, I have some sympathy with that remark. I mean, I think Canada, in a sense, has an advantage because unlike European countries, it doesn't have a sort of base culture in quite the same way that, a Britain does or a France does. The difference with America is that America is very much a country based on sort of certain ideas and shared ideas and values. And Canada is less of an ideologically formed country, I would say, than America is. And so it's kind of easy for Canada as a sort of a default option to say, diversity is our identity.
Yes, I mean, I would say that when a country starts to define itself by its multiculturalism, by its pluralism, by its internationalism, there are various things you have to do. One of them is to very, very much water down your self-definition as a country, or effectively to make it so broad as to become almost, if not entirely, meaningless. Canada has the advantage, as you say, of not having that strong French identity or a strong, almost one might even still say a British identity that's relatively strong. And so it's got an advantage in that regard. A relatively soft national identity is always going to find it easier to integrate, bring in many, many more people. If the numbers go up, continue to come up, and the identity questions continue to go, you can't avoid these discussions in perpetuity.
Brooke Unger.
Well, I think it's very interesting to look at actually the case of Quebec in Canada, because Quebec has a slightly different problem from English-speaking Canada, and that is that unlike what we've said about English-speaking Canada, where kind of diversity is at the very, very core of identity, Quebec does have a kind of an alternative core, as it were, and that is, French-speaking culture. And it actually thinks a little bit differently about immigration and multiculturalism than the rest of Canada does. And in fact, it prefers to talk about what it calls interculturalism, which is this notion that, there is this kind of core, but this core can be supplemented with all kinds of other things, that we acknowledge kind of a common core, but, things can branch out from that. And I think that's a very interesting way to look at it. And I think it's something that, in a way, is more applicable than to other countries that are dealing with the question of immigration.
Well, on to round two now. Canada is clearly attractive to a certain kind of liberal. Are you foreseeing, Douglas, an exodus to Canada?
Well, I can see why so many liberal Americans look to Canada. It's obviously got a number of things that they admire, and not least a hereditary left-wing leadership. It seems to be an American democratic fetish these days.
You're referring to Justin Trudeau's family there.
Absolutely. By the way, I don't believe this for a moment that any of the people saying this and looking to this are really serious. I don't think there's ever going to be an exodus. Really, all of the Los Angeles liberals are really going to move to Toronto?
No, I don't think Americans are going to move en masse to Canada. But what I think will happen and could happen is I think that the election of Donald Trump has been quite damaging to American soft power. I think Canada's soft power has been sort of greatly enhanced, partly by that, partly by the openness and liberalism that the government of Canada preaches. And I think that will actually benefit Canada in some ways. I think you're going to see that people who know how to code are going to look at moving to Canada rather than Silicon Valley, for example.
Furrowed brow from Douglas.
Well, just that the soft power thing interests me on this, because to enjoy the benefits of soft power, you also have to have the capability to exert hard power. And one of the things which I think is a mistake that Canada has fallen for, but isn't alone in falling for, is this notion that developed Western democracies can get to a point where their best asset is their liberalism, where their best asset is their export of, as it were, soft power. I just think, again, this is a temporary phase. I've seen it in other countries, Sweden being an obvious example. Sweden has a similar-ish view of its own ability to integrate that Canada does. And actually, when it takes people in very large numbers, turns out to be horrible at integrating people, absolutely terrible at it. And meantime, it says, well, we are going to exert our soft power. Its soft power suffers as a result. So Sweden, for instance, now ends up spending more of its annual budget on immigration costs than it does on its military.
Well, part of what Canada is proclaiming and being recognized for at the moment are actually things that Canada has been doing for, decades, if not hundreds of years. It has been integrating newcomers for a very long time. It has been a champion of free trade for a very long time. And so it's really the contrast that Canada represents with other parts of the West, which are moving away from that makes Canada so striking. So, I think that to suggest that Canada has sort of adopted some kind of a new faddish formula for success is not right.
And on to round three. Let's hear from Justin Trudeau about how his election campaign handled feelings of disenfranchisement in society without, he reckons, exploiting them.
We just chose to build a campaign that drew on those values and beliefs about Canada in a positive way.
But other leaders, including Donald Trump, have run campaigns that do exploit anxieties about migrants. How harmful has this been, and might Canada be the antidote? So, Brooke, we heard Justin Trudeau there. Some people love that elevated rhetoric. Some people think it's a bit goody-goody. Do you think that he is saying something that can readily be exported in the way that governments approach the debate, the tone of the debate about immigration?
Well, I certainly think people need to hear more of what Justin Trudeau is saying, especially now. That doesn't mean that the Canadian approach to multiculturalism can be sort of transferred without modification to other parts of the world. It can't. There are, different countries have very different histories and very different senses of themselves. But what Trudeau is saying, I think, is an important reminder to people who are forgetting the value of diversity and the importance of continued openness.
We just chose to build a campaign that drew on values and beliefs about Canada in a positive way. Justin Trudeau tells us there, Douglas, self-praises. rarely a recommendation from political leaders, but he's got a point, hasn't he?
He does in a way. I think one thing, of course, is that he had, it's horrible to put it in these terms, he had an enormous advantage before the last election with the tragedy of the Aylan Kurdi family, which, if you remember, the young boy whose body was washed up on the shores of Turkey, whose family appeared to be attempting finally to get to Canada. And this became a very big issue in the election campaign. And the Harper government, which had been, tougher in its rhetoric on immigration and all this sort of thing,
Conservative predecessor,
was definitely on a very weak back foot from the moment that tragedy came forward. Because in the same way that an individual tragedy in immigration can be impossible to resist effectively, and this is what I think the Harper government and the Trudeau opposition they were running at the time really took advantage of. The Canadian people did not want to be a country that turned away somebody and a young boy's body ends up on a beach. Now, I think they approached this whole debate wrongly, but undoubtedly the emotion, the emotiveness of it desperately benefited Trudeau.
But surely, Brooke Unger, one of the reasons that Liberals are so attracted to Trudeau is he's one of them who actually won when so many of them are actually losing.
Well, I mean, it's one of the very striking things about Canada that Canadian voters turn to, as you point out, a dynast. And there's, no sort of more middle-of-the-road kind of centrist party in the country. And so, for those of us who don't think the establishment is awful and who favor kind of centrist middle-of-the-road policies, it's rather heartening to see a candidate like that win. And one of the things that it's very early days for Justin Trudeau, and, he'll suffer political wear and tear like all politicians do. But, he has some fiscal room to make some changes that can actually benefit people. And so, I'm certainly hoping that his government will be kind of a demonstration for how, mainstream middle-of-the-road centrist policies can lessen resentment and anger.
Can I make one point about this, by the way, which is it seems hard to my mind to see much water between what Trudeau ran on and what Ignatieff ran on, the previous head of the Liberal Party in Canada, who, of course, led them to a catastrophic defeat. And I'm not sure what lessons one can take from this other than that Trudeau was a more attractive personality and was not seen to be a sort of Harvard law professor who'd pop by to run the country for a bit. But that suggests it's a cult of personality, not a success of Liberal politics.
And our final round 4. Brooke, can Liberalism be imposed from the top down, as some might think Canadians do?
Well, I'm not sure it's right to say that Canada is imposing liberalism from the top down. I think there is kind of a Canadian consensus. That Canadian consensus has been built up over a long time. It's enshrined in Canada's documents. But I think it's something that Canadians pretty much buy into, this notion of good government, peace, order, respect for other people.
There's a very interesting observation that Fleming Rose, the Danish editor, made in his book on free speech recently, which was that the presumption of political leaders across the Western world has been the more diverse a society becomes, the less speech you can have, the less free speech should have. He makes the point, and I entirely agree with, that actually the more diverse society, the more you've got to get used to a very wide range of speech, and that they've got it exactly wrong, the political class, on this. Canada, to this extent, has got it more wrong than anyone, because Canada has not only the same hate speech laws and things that have come in Western democracies in Western Europe, but also another set of courts, the human rights commissions, which act as courts in Canada. Anyone can take a complaint about anyone to these courts. They drag you through a process that can often last years, at the end of which people get fined, people get silenced. Effectively, you can be stopped from writing.
But give me an example.
Let me give you an example. I know a couple of people who suffered from this. Journalists in Canada. Mark Stein, for instance, wrote a cover piece in Maclean's magazine some years ago, and various Muslim groups in Canada complained about it. And he was taken through a set of these so-called human rights tribunals, where people who couldn't even make the clock on the wall work decided to police the sentiment, ask questions about the jokes. Was this joke appropriate and all this sort of thing? And the interesting thing about this is that the process is the punishment. People end up hundreds of thousands of dollars out of pocket. And this is a government-enforced silencing.
Now, that does sound like liberalism from the top down, Brooke.
It actually sounds like conservatism from the top down, or restricted liberalism from the top down, which you just described as the opposite of liberalism. And
I think so.
I don't defend it either. But where I would disagree with you is you seem to be implying that an openness to cultural diversity is necessarily connected to a rigidity on free speech. And I certainly don't think that has to be the case. I mean, it is true that Canada has both in some ways, but, that is more of a coincidence than a necessity, I would say.
I agree. It's not necessary, but I would say it's commonplace in each country grappling with this. And to that extent, Canada is typical. Very quick thought, if I may. One reason why Canada is slightly better on this, and some praise should be given, is that they are light years ahead of most other countries on the details of integration. And one very quick example, under the Harper government, the last Conservative government, they had an integration minister in Jason Kenney, who I remember once when he visited London, was so far ahead of his London counterparts. They had a problem at the time of some radical Muslim groups in Canada. And when he came to London, he met a Muslim leader in London. Who did he meet? Now, of course, all the civil servants were delighted. It all looked great. He met an Ahmadiyya leader in London, a leader of a minority sect. That was so intelligent. He met the minority leader, but he met a minority leader who the really crazy people back in Canada would have hated him seeing. He effectively smoked out the bad guys within his own country. That is so much more developed than anything you'd get from London or Washington.
Douglas Murray and Brooke Unger teasing out the Canadian model there. Thank you both.
You didn't frankly have the balls to put country before party.